This is The Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis.
And welcome to a live question and answer edition of The Newsagents, streaming on Global Player and YouTube. We've been asking for your questions. You've sent many of them in, fabulous questions, and we're going to get to them over the next 35 to 40 minutes. And please keep the questions coming. You'll be able to listen to this episode as a normal podcast, just like you normally would at around 5 o'clock.
You can relive
this
it.
Afternoon.
People lucky enough to be watching it live can relive it over the course of the weekend.
And before we come to the first question, Lewis, can we discuss your knitwear?
Please. What do you want to discuss?
Well, it's a blue jumper with mountains, 1924, and the Olympic rings.
Jon,
I've never seen you as a winter Olympian.
A winter sportsman. Why do you say that?
Have you ever been skiing?
I went to the Birmingham dry ski slope once. I fell over. It's the 102nd anniversary of the 1924 Winter Olympics, Jon. And if that's not a good enough reason to wear a jumper in celebration, I don't know what is.
Where were they?
Well, can you guess?
Chamonix.
Correct. More Winter Olympic 1924 trivia to come throughout the show.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
No.
Oh, yes.
Oh, no. Right, let's get on to the first question and not make Lewis Goodall's knitwear options the subject of this podcast. Anita has been in touch. My 14-year-old, who's studying GCSE, has asked if we are now in World War III. What would your response be? P.S. Love the podcast. Big fan.
This is obviously a question which is actually being discussed a lot at military level and strategic level, and actually quite a few very senior, disturbingly, chillingly, senior military figures just from the UK in the last few years have told us that we need to start thinking about ourselves not in a post-war state, but a pre-war state, because the idea is that we are now in a period of sort of great power rivalry, not entirely dissimilar perhaps to the world we saw in the run-up to 1914 and the First World War. And the reason it is chilling is because although we in Britain kind of think very often about the kind of Second World War, for example, as having a very settled sort of start date, which is the 1st of September 1939 when Nazi Germany invades Poland. Of course, lots of historians, and particularly depending on where you are in the world, will put that date at a rather different moment. You know, in Asia, you might put it in 1937 or in 1931 at the start of 1933, depending on when you define the sort of outbreak of war between Japan and China. Likewise, different parts of Europe, Central Europe would, if you're in Czechoslovakia, for example, you'd probably say it started in 1938. So there is absolutely a case to say that you might say, we might look back in decades to come and say that actually we are now, as we speak, in a war state, and it started in, 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, or 2022 when Russia invaded Crimea. I think, though, and that's all totally possible, I am wary, though, of being too deterministic about history. And the fact is, although we can always look back on history and sort of identify big structural forces, and that has a sort of air of determinism or inevitability about it, the fact is we do have agency. Yes, the world does feel a lot like it did perhaps in the Cold War or perhaps in the years leading up to 1914. Lots of great powers, lots of proxy wars, lots of attempts to conduct hybrid warfare, use different militias and all sorts of different things with lots of regional hotspots which at any given moment could pull in the great powers. But we're not there yet, and our leaders can avoid it, and there is a danger sometimes of making it sound like war is inevitable, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, to your point about, people will take different views about when the war started. The most classic is the United States of America, that thinks the Second World War was from 1942 to 1945. After Pearl Harbor, when America then entered the war, that's when it sees the war going. What was happening during the Blitz, is in London, is not part of America's view of when the Second World War took place. I suppose the other thing I would say about this is that I think there is a temptation when you say it's World War III to think of it, it's going to be like World War I and it's going to be World War II again, and there are going to be these trenches, and, Flanders Field is going to see tens of thousands of lives lost over a patch of muddy kind of field that has been blown to smithereens a million times. I don't think it's going to be like that because there are so many nuclear powers in the world right now, and I think that will limit people's countries' ambitions to push it to the limit, because they know that nuclear Armageddon could follow. But what I do think is so depressing is the scene of yet another kind of action being started with no idea of what the end of it looks like. You know, we've seen what's happened over the past week in Iran. What does the end of this look like? When is America satisfied that it has achieved its war aims? What would lead to them declaring victory? And I'm afraid it is just entirely down to Donald Trump and what he thinks. But in the meantime, you know, you're hearing all sorts of strange reports, maybe uncorroborated, but, you know, the Iraqi forces are thinking of crossing into Iran. And I mean, this is where it can spin out of control so quickly. And the one thing that is so true of history, and this isn't being deterministic, this is just a historical fact, it's much easier to start wars than it is to end them.
Well, indeed, and that actually relatively minor things, in the grand scheme of things, unexpected things, can create much more minor than the sort of thing we've seen this week, can have consequences that literally last for generations. I mean, on paper, the murder, assassination of an Austrian Archduke on the streets of Sarajevo should not lead to the greatest conflagration at that time that the world had ever seen. And yet it did. And we are seeing, and with the Middle East, you have a kind of region which is not unlike the Balkans or Central Europe was in the First World War, is that you have basically a tinderbox of different ethnicities and religions and, states that have a long history of warfare with each other, anything of which, and lots of states around it that, until, like, as we've seen with the UAE or the Gulf states, they had no anticipation of being dragged into this until this week and then find themselves at war. So there are always echoes. And I think the thing with Trump, people often like to say, oh, he's really unpredictable. Sometimes that can be a good thing. It is true that makes world leaders less cognizant or less able to predict how he will act, and it might make them a little bit more cautious. But it's also true, the flip side of it is that he does things like this. He does things like this without any, let's be honest, any understanding whatsoever of the historic, ethnic, religious, or deep political schisms which operate in a region like that. And all he thinks about is news cycles. When a region like that operates on generational, centuries-long cycles of politics and warfare and strife, and then into that you have Donald Trump's quixotic personality. And I think you're seeing the consequences of that this week.
So last night I had someone give me the best analysis that I've heard so far of why this all makes sense. And it was quite interesting to listen to. So let me run it past you. Trump next month is going to see President Xi in China. President Xi from China showed his power over Donald Trump when he said, I'm going to stop the export of rare earth metals, and Trump then had to reduce his tariffs as a result. America has taken control of Venezuelan oil. If it took control of Iranian oil as well, then that is going to be a big hit to the Chinese economy, which imports a lot of oil currently from China. And therefore, when President Trump goes to see President Xi, if he's got control of Venezuelan oil and he's got control of Iranian oil as well, that gives Donald Trump an awful lot of leverage in his negotiations.
What does control of Iranian oil look like in practice? I mean, what's he going to do? Occupy the country, take control of its ports, of its oil production? I just don't know what that looks like in practice. And also, maybe, but then, I mean, the short-term corollary of it, as we discussed yesterday, even medium-term one, is that the country that he's empowered through the spike of the oil price is Vladimir Putin and liquid gas prices, a man who was basically on the run this year because he was running down his foreign currency reserves.
And because of the fact that it's led to a spike in oil prices, what has Donald Trump done? He's lifted some of the embargoes, the sanctions on Russian oil, because he's terrified of prices going up at American petrol pumps.
I don't know. I sometimes think...
I mean, it was interesting to hear someone come up with a rational explanation, because so far it's been very difficult to see anything where you think this is clearly thought through.
But we've talked about this a little bit before as well with Trump, which is that I just think that we all want to find the rational explanations for these things because John, you and I, and probably everybody listening and watching this right now, we all crave it because there is safety in reason. And there is safety in logic. We like to try and think that there must be some sort of deeper meaning and deeper motive behind someone as powerful as that. Because if that isn't true, it becomes terrifying, right? It becomes terrifying to think that basically so much of the fate of the global economy, of global order and our lives basically rest upon the inner life of a man who defies reason and doesn't think very much. And so we spend all of our time analysing desperately, trying to find the thread, trying to find what might be behind the sort of throne, But like sometimes the Wizard of Oz is just that. There's nothing there. There's nothing there beyond this sort of screaming bag of wriggling political urges, right? Which is basically what I think he is. You know, he's a man who is easily persuaded. I think Netanyahu has probably done that. He's a man who I think has got addicted to the use of military force. He's a man pretty uninterested in the boredom of domestic politics, I think, at this point. He's a man who's vanquished most of his foes. He's a man who needs enemies and he needs adversaries. And he's a man who likes to be, you know, likes to think, frankly, he has big dick energy, right? And what better way of showing that than deploying the full might of the American military? I find that scary. I kind of think it puts us out of a bit of a job, because our job is to try and find the inner deeper meaning. But I fear that very often it is just imposing order on a disorder which actually exists.
Lewis, we got a question from Anita, whose 14-year-old is studying for a GCSE.
Can she use that phrase?
And you talk about big dick energy.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Anita, maybe your offspring should not be using that phrase in their GCSE...
Offspring? What is this, Brave New World?
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley.
Well, I just don't know what gender, so I'm just saying your child should not be using big dick energy, and I'd like to apologise for Lewis Goodall and his use of language.
My apologies. We've actually got a question as well, before we get to that, from Nick Garrett on the YouTube live chat, since we're talking about Trump, who says, could Trump use this war as a pretense to restrict or even cancel the midterms?
Again, it's a leap. I think that the midterms will happen. I think that the midterms are going to happen, but it's going to be a different sort of way that Donald Trump is going to try to control the outcome. And if you look at what the ICE officials did in Minneapolis, and it's notable while we're talking about what's happening in America, that the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, was fired yesterday by Donald Trump. I think it's going to be something like that. And it goes like this. You invoke the Insurrection Act, which means that you put federal forces in certain places where you think there could be disorder. And if you're worried about election security, you maybe put huge numbers of officers around precincts which are heavily Democrat, where large numbers of Hispanic people go to vote, which ensure that maybe the Democrats win that particular district. And does the Hispanic person think, I don't want to produce my papers. I don't want some guy poking a gun into my chest and saying, show me your passport, show me you're a legal citizen in this country. And they stay away. And you suppress turnout in that district, and you deliver victory to Republicans who might have otherwise not stood a chance. I think that is a much more foreseeable route than Trump going down the route and saying, it's war, we can't possibly have an election. And I would just say that, you know, America was in a world war, was in the Second World War, and the 1944 presidential election still took place.
Indeed. I think that I think if this war is still going on, come November, then something bad has, really happened, that this has sort of got out of control, in which case we're probably going to be having a different conversation full stop. I think, like you said, John, I think it's far more likely that if the midterms are contested, as in the outcomes are contested and they're interfered with, which I think is totally possible, at least in some places, then I think that it's far more likely to come about and arise as a result of internal domestic reasons that Trump puts forward, much more akin to the sort of things we saw in Minnesota and Minneapolis that we reported on in January. That it's about immigration. He claims that, foreign migrants, illegals are sort of interfering, and then he deploys ICE and all of that sort of stuff. I think it's far more internal than anything to do with war or something that's going on externally. Before we get to the next question, John, just important question here. Which country was banned from competing in the 1924 Winter Olympics?
Well, actually, technically, I refute the basis of your question, because in 1924, when those countries gathered, it wasn't the Olympics. It was only decreed the Olympics in 1926.
Okay, well, all right.
All
right, Stephen Fry. Just as a reminder for those who've just tuned in, we're doing this because I'm wearing a jumper in honour of the 1924
You're very performative, aren't you?
Games.
You just want to be the centre of attention, don't you?
No, what, me? You? What, us? The three of us on this show? Leaving the BBC to go and start our own podcast and show all about us, what we want to be centre of the attention? No, I wouldn't have thought so. Come on, which country was banned?
Russia.
No, Germany. Because of the First World War. Still hadn't got over it.
Still hadn't got over the Treaty of Versailles.
I'm very much not. And I think that I don't think the Germans got over it for some time. Next question, as you say, we had that question from Anita, and now we've got a question from Sean Haggerty. Sean Haggerty.
Sean Haggerty. It's not Sean Hannity.
I would be quite surprised if Sean Hannity were a viewer of our show. I mean, hey, look, they're all welcome.
Everyone welcome.
Everyone's welcome, Sean. If you ever fancy doing some guest spots, should Keir Starmer, Sean says, stay polite with Donald Trump, or is it time to start returning the insults? I can't imagine Keir Starmer insulting anyone, really.
No, and honestly,
it's a bit like the Geoffrey Howe thing or the Dennis Healey thing about Geoffrey
Savage
Howe
by a dead sheep.
Savage by a dead sheep. I can't quite see it.
Yeah, exactly. And funnily enough, there was something else that made me think of Geoffrey Howe and Dennis Healey earlier
I
this
think about
week.
them all the time.
Which was when, kind of America says jump. This was the kind of charge laid at Geoffrey Howe when he was the Conservative Foreign Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's government, and Healey was the shadow Foreign Secretary, and and it was after kind of the latest bit of capitulation by the UK to the US, and Dennis Healey said to Howe, when America says jump, you say how high. And I think that there's an element of that as well going on now, whereas actually Starmer has said no. Now, I don't think it's a time for returning insults. I think it's a time for, if you believe that what you're doing is the right thing, it's the time for standing firm and just being very calm, very measured. But I think to get into a slanging match with Donald Trump, no one wins. Donald Trump has always got better insults than you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are members of his cabinet today who tried that.
Yeah,
in a long distant past. Yeah, exactly. And some of his fiercest advocates today, Ted Cruz, or all the rest of them, they've all tried to play him in his game. And the truth is, no one is as petty or as venal or as willing to go as low as he is.
Yeah.
You can't beat him. And so you might as well, they've concluded you might as well join him. Starmer is not in that category, but he has to conclude, he has to work with him. Right? I actually think, like we've been saying all week, yeah, there have been some stories about, splits in his cabinet and, about his personal political strength, whatever. I still think that there is a strong possibility that we look back at this week and say that Starmer had one of his best weeks, because he has, despite the enormous clamour that I still can't quite understand, the sort of British media war machine has sort of got into full gear as well, completely forgotten about every single lesson of Iraq and Libya and our constant meddling in the Middle East. I don't say this as a pacifist, by the way. I say this as someone who's quite hawkish on quite a lot of these matters. But nonetheless, I'm pro-American. But nonetheless, basically, 90% of the British media has been desperate for Keir Starmer to do something that basically almost no one in Britain wants him to do, which is to sign up to a war without objective, without end, or without method, sign up British troops to take part in it, basically completely outsource our foreign policy to the most unhinged occupant of the Oval Office who has ever existed. And they want him to do that and put British troops in harm's way for no apparent reason, just because Trump wants him to do. And I think that he has shown a fair bit of steel and a fair bit of judgment, actually, in refusing to do so. And people often say that, they think that he ought to be stronger and that he ought to, show us who he really is. I think he has shown us who he really is this week. And I think it's to be commended.
Yeah, and look, I agree completely, and we've both been on the same page of this. I was with someone last night, former kind of senior civil servant, who was saying he should have just done one thing or the other. You either go all in like Canada and Australia did, or you make a principled stand and then you don't move from that.
But I don't really understand that, because how could he, when our allies are being attacked, how could he then refuse? And if American soldiers are being fired upon by Iran, how could he refuse the Americans the opportunity to defend, to use our bases to defend them? On some sense, we would then be partly responsible for their deaths.
But you wonder whether it will move again.
Possibly.
I think that there's going to be another nudge, and David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister, sort of almost hinted as much this morning in a radio interview that Britain could start taking out some of these.
Well, I suppose if the Iranians start to attack British military assets on a more, I know it's sort
missiles
of
at RAF Akrotiri.
Yeah, but if it starts happening in a more sustained way, and there's certainly if anybody's killed or anything like that, I suppose we'll have no choice. Although it does seem that the Iranians are running out of missiles, they're running out of ballistics quite rapidly. So I'm not sure the extent to which they're going to have missiles and drones to spare to start attacking British targets.
That's interesting because is it possible that it may be that they're running out of ballistic missiles, or they're rationing them because they want to play this very long, and so to still be able to cause mayhem and surprise by launching another ballistic missile attack.
Possibly. All I just think we've got to the end of the week, and it is clear that this has spiralled so rapidly out of control.
Azerbaijan.
And I think that Starmer could see that coming and didn't want any part of it, and I think that's fair enough. Sam in London says, earlier this week, a Marine veteran named Brian McGuinness shouted protests against the Iran war during a congressional hearing. He resisted being ejected from the chamber. A Republican senator named Tim Sheehy, himself a former Navy SEAL, joined the effort to throw McGuinness out. As McGuinness clung to the door and shouted, "No one wants to fight for Israel," Sheehy's forces snapped his arm. Has something left the soul of American civilization? Has so-called toxic masculinity in America now become weapons grade?
Sam, it's a very interesting question, and it's very troubling the way some of the political debate is covered. And I know we've got a question as well about the language being used by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, except he's still the Defence Secretary, where I think that...
Small dick energy, I think, from Pete Hegseth.
You've got a thing going here. Yeah,
famously.
Okay, you are going to be banned from the studio. One more use of the word dick, okay?
Okay, sorry, John.
There we are.
Mr. Sopel.
We've just got to keep certain standards up here. We may have
I
left
can't
the
believe
BBC.
you just said that.
We've got to keep standards going. For God's sake, this is Britain. I don't know. I think that for the most part, the thing that struck me when I moved to America was the civility of so many people. And these two things are going side by side, which is kind of gives a lot of dissonance in the sense that you meet people and you'll meet a MAGA Republican, and they'll be polite and they'll be charming and they'll be very, but then you kind of hear their views and they start getting very aggressive. There is undoubtedly much more frat boy towel snapping energy, and the way that debate is conducted has moved into the political sphere. I would say that America has always had a much more robustious political dynamic than Britain. And, if you go back to the first Gulf War and storming Norman Schwarzkopf, who was in charge of US forces then, and it was the first time we'd seen sort of video film of attacks taking place. And it was, a kind of bridge, a lorry going across a bridge and the bridge getting blown up and them all having a laugh about it. I mean, some of that stuff has been going on for quite a long time now. But I do think you're right. Look, the tolerance of opposition and respectfully disagreeing is not something you're seeing a huge amount of in the States right now.
No, that's right. I mean, look, I do think that there has been, in fairness, that there has long been this strain of political violence in the United States. I don't just mean political violence in the streets. I also mean in terms of the rhetoric. It's always just beneath the surface. It's weird because on the one hand, in Britain, our parliamentary activity, our chair, the House of Commons, is often much more robust than we see in the United States. I mean, the Congress, you know this better than anyone, John, but, I've sat in congressional debates. I mean, quite literally, it is absolutely, I can even think of some of our rival podcasts I'd rather listen to as opposed to that. I mean, honestly. How you doing, Rory? Anyway.
No dick energy.
Right. That is the last time. Anyway, they are literally a senator or whatever literally goes into the chamber, literally gives a speech to an empty room apart from the presiding officer, literally just to put it on the record. No debate, no nothing. We don't have that. Thankfully our chamber is much more alive. And yet occasionally in American politics, the strain of kind of violence that we sort of saw this week, just beneath the surface, even in a parliament, is there. And obviously the most famous example is what happened with Charles Sumner in the Civil War. Charles Sumner, anti-slavery senator, 2 days later, pro-slavery Congressman Preston Brooks walks into the Senate chamber, nearly beats him to death with a cane on the Senate floor. And this is one of the sort of great events that leads up to the Civil War beginning in 1860. Literally a guy beats death. And actually, when the guy who beat Sumner went into the Senate chamber a couple of days later, he was cheered by the pro-slavery side. So this strain of violence in American politics is long-standing. It's long been there. But I think it's fair to say that with the hyper-polarisation and hyper-partisanship that we now see in American politics and the kind of twin realities, which sort of you could argue kind of existed in the 19th century, you could argue the kind of more settled post-war world was the kind of exception in American politics and American history, and I think there's a sort of strong case for that. But nonetheless, you have seen all of these fuse and come together, and you see extraordinary scenes like we've seen this week.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that you're absolutely right. I mean, Senate debates, congressional debates, the hearings are tedious, often beyond belief. The House of Commons, when the Nazis bombed the Commons chamber in the Second World War, Churchill decreed that you actually had to maintain that, one, that it should be adversarial, the MPs facing each other from one side to the other. Two, that it should be too small for all the MPs to fit into, so that you had that sense of it being crowded and slightly claustrophobic. And if you ever visit the Commons chamber, you'll notice there are two red lines on either side of the green benches down the carpet, and those are 2 sword lengths apart, which means you mustn't cross there where you could attack each other with a sword. But of course they don't do. So we have a very adversarial system, but we do not have that history. I mean, yes, there have been terrible instances of MPs being killed in recent years, but we don't have that same sort of history of political violence in the same way that they do in America.
Just on some more 1924 trivia.
Oh, good.
An Olympic medal was given for an event, something that had taken place 2 years before. Can you guess what it was? It was for a special category of Olympic event that has not been repeated ever in any Olympics since. Before or since.
Firing someone out of a cannon.
It's not the Circus Olympics, John. What do you think Coco the Clown's been given a bronze?
You are reducing this podcast to a circus, Mr. Goodall.
Right, OK. It was actually given for Mount Everest. There was a special award for a category called Alpinism, given to the members of the 1922 British Mount Everest expedition, even though they didn't reach the summit, but they still got a gold.
So they got a gold medal for not getting there?
I know, it's pathetic, isn't it?
They should have saved it.
The rot started to set in this country when that happened.
Exactly.
We started to rewards for failure.
Exactly. Should have saved it until Sir Edmund Hillary got up there.
Of course, we've got our eye on a new award, haven't we, John?
Oh, what? The crime agents?
No, not the crime. No, I'm not even thinking about them. I'm talking about the Golden Globes.
Oh, yeah. The Golden Globes have now
new
got a
podcast awards.
Yeah, we are going to be there.
So if anyone does know anyone on the Golden Globes award committee, whatever that is, then we're very grateful for your representation.
And obviously, we're available for bribes and other means to which you could influence the decision of the judges. All you need to do is ask. We'll give.
Correct. And we've got another YouTube question here, which is, when is the next live tour? Well, it could be in LA if we get the Golden Globes. Is it possible to do that with the number of holidays John and Emily have? Great question. Great question. I don't think it would be possible. Well, unless we did it in the Asia Pacific.
Yeah. I mean, Emily is, as we speak, feeding kangaroos, I think.
Yes.
She seems to have been doing rather a lot since she's got to Australia. See, I go to Australia so often that.
Well, yes. I mean, we're only on the 6th of March, and between you, I believe you spent a whole month in Australia this year.
Wait, were you here last week? The week before?
Well, I was away for 5 days.
Yeah, well, you were still
in
away.
Lanzarote. I think that is honestly, I think I deserve that.
Lanzarote?
That's what they call it. It's actually very lovely.
Honestly.
But it's not the Asia Pacific, is it?
Well, no.
They won't let me go that. I can't go that far, because if I go that far, one of you will end up feeding some bloody Joey in New South Wales or God knows where.
Are you suggesting you are indispensable?
Yes.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
I think we've got a voice note from Adam in North London.
Good morning, newsagents. I'm Adam from North London, and I wanted to ask, which former Prime Minister would you most like to see a comeback of, given the current geopolitical tensions?
Go on.
You're not allowed to say Tony Blair, John.
I'm not going to.
No?
Well, okay, go on.
I think, continuing on from where we started, which is that the world increasingly looks a bit sort of pre-First World War, maybe like Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a spiky, clever statesman. The Welsh wizard, very clever statesman, represented the UK at Versailles, which was basically, that really was the board of peace of its day, a sort of world government. I think you need someone who is able, who has that sort of like Quicksilver approach. And actually, it's actually been quite rare to sort of go on a sort of prolonged defence of Keir Starmer. But you know what? I don't think that for all of his other faults, which are there, particularly on the domestic sphere, I can think of worse prime ministers to currently be in place right now. And I think there are other prime ministers who would have gone along with the kind of drumbeat to war machine and make the fatal mistake, which I think Blair did make, which was that a British prime minister has to be with the American president come what may, despite the fact that whether it's the Vietnam War with Harold Wilson, and LBJ, or vice versa with the Falklands. I mean, people forget now, for all of how close Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were, in the early days and weeks of the Falklands War, Reagan tried to, because Argentina was an important ally in the Cold War for him, anti-communist ally, he tried to sort of be a sort of mediating figure between the two sides, much to Thatcher's fury. He eventually sort of weighs in behind the British. But there are lots and lots of occasions during the post-war period where Britain and America are not on the same page. They're in the same book, to extend the metaphor, but they're not always on the same page.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that Starmer, as a on the world stage, has looked very comfortable. I mean, it looks like he's kind of at ease with these people. He knows what the national interest is. He knows where he wants to be. He's worked out that, he wants to have a much closer relationship with Europe, and while still maintaining good relations with the US. I mean, I suppose my slight hesitation about your question, Adam, is the idea that any British leader is going to make any difference to the geopolitical tensions when you've got someone like Donald Trump in the White House and you've got Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. I'm not sure how biddable these people are. I'm not sure what you could say to Netanyahu or to what is left of the Iranian leadership that would have any impact whatsoever. And I just think that we sometimes exaggerate the role that we can play in these things of reducing tensions in the world when this is superpower stuff and we ain't no superpower.
I know, this has been one of the things that's frustrated me throughout the course of the week in terms of some of the commentary. I've seen loads and loads of commentary saying, particularly from some commentators on the right, saying, Britain has never felt less relevant. Oh. Britain has never, in all my lifetime. It's like, yeah, well, we probably haven't been. I mean, that's probably true because Britain has been on one long relative decline. We are a middle-ranking power, still an important country. We've got important military player. We used to be more important than we are now, partly because we were in the EU and we were a leading player in the EU, we could corral that. But the truth is, some of those people who've been making those complaints this week have been central to the diminishment of Britain's standing over that period, because the pillars of our foreign policy used to be the transatlantic alliance, our EU membership, and to a lesser extent our Commonwealth connections. Well, the Commonwealth has never been less relevant. The transatlantic alliance is now led by a man who likes Britain in the sense of it. He likes the thought of it, and he likes the monarchy. He likes the thought of us as a sort of theme park, but has no real attachment to us or anybody else, and is completely and utterly unpredictable. And we're now on the outer periphery of Europe, out in the cold, because we're not within the political structures of the EU. So guess what? Yeah, we do feel less relevant than we have before, because basically over the last 10 years, some of these people who are complaining, some of it structural as well, and some of it relative decline, has consigned Britain to a less powerful standing than we used to have. And that isn't Keir Starmer's fault. Oh, and just by the way, in answer to on the Prime Minister's question, of course, we did have a Prime Minister, another bit of trivia here, who spoke some Farsi. So we could have him. Do you know who that was, John?
Yeah, it wasn't Liz Truss, was it?
Oh, she's speaking something. I think she speaks in tongues these days. No, Anthony Eden.
Anthony
Eden spoke.
Funny enough, I was going to guess Eden, and I was going to
not that it helped him with his Middle Eastern
no, but I was going to say
very
Eden is the person, because my God, the mistakes he made, and when you talk about the relevance of Britain, I mean, wasn't that the turning point? The Suez Crisis, when the globe was
Keir Starmer responsible for that? Probably, if you read the Daily Mail.
But there you had a time where Britain thought it could still go on a post-imperial course with the French and the Israelis to block the nationalisation of the Suez Canal. And what happens is that America says, no, you've got to stop. And Britain says, no, we're going to carry on. And America says, OK, we'll bankrupt you. And Britain folded. Anthony Eden was left in, had to resign as Prime Minister. It was a catastrophe.
And this is what's so irritating about the kind of, we don't hear much about global Britain anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Because global Britain and Brexit, and look, as I've always said, there's so many faults with the EU. I'm not a massive actual EU Europhile, but the fact of the matter is that, what happened 10 years ago now is we basically decided to leave the EU on the basis of a world that we can see in 2026 no longer exists. It was a still relatively settled post-Cold War world, where it was a world where we assumed that the direction was against protectionism and towards free trade, and a world where the geopolitical order was relatively settled. What have we seen instead? We are now find ourselves as Britain, little Britain, we find ourselves in a situation where we can't go into the world as global Britain, because we see massive both commercial, trade, and military geopolitical power blocks, whether it's the United States, Russia, China, all playing out these proxy wars all over the world, engaged in massive great power rivalry and competition. And where do we find ourselves? These people sort of complaining that we're not at the table. No, we're not at the table. Because the only way conceivably we really could have been at the table is leading or part of a large European bloc. And that is no longer available to us.
Let's get this question from Matt in Bournemouth. Do you think one reason Trump has decided to take this action in Iran now is to create another distraction from the Epstein files? Love the show. And please do another tour. There's a demand for us to be out on tour.
I know.
Well, I mean,
we're like the Beach Boys.
Really?
Okay.
Just take that metaphor one step further.
Well,
what, we're all blonde-haired?
Yeah, sex symbols of many decades standing. In your case, John, fewer decades in my case. Maybe a few more to come.
Weren't you at the 1924 Olympics?
Oh,
John?
I was building up to that.
Yeah,
I was building
that
up.
was
You were probably covering the luge. Après-moi le luge. That was his joke.
Yeah,
that was his opening joke. Going on tour.
You were doing the luge.
Yes,
anyway.
quite. Go on.
So I don't believe that the Epstein files is part of this. I think that there are times... I mean, Trump has tried to distract people away from the Epstein files, and every single time has only made things worse. When he's told people there's no need to release the files, that Congress shouldn't pass the law, try to pressure them, every step of the way, Trump has drawn attention to the Epstein files. So the idea that you would launch a war with Iran and Israel, I don't buy it. I just don't think that it's... the Epstein files will come back. Go on, are you going to entertain it?
No, I don't think it was about the Epstein files. I think he does other things to distract from the Epstein files. But as you say, John, I don't quite... But frankly, the Epstein files, they've sort of come and gone as far as Trump is concerned. He has been able, despite the fact that clearly, there are potentially questions to answer for him, despite the fact there are accusations made, particularly by some Democratic congressmen and women who have seen the unredacted files, that they claim that Donald Trump is in them and are in files that have been redacted with his name on and so on. Despite all of that fact, the truth is that the political pressure from his own side just hasn't been there on him. He's managed quite successfully, the Republicans in Congress have managed quite successfully to make it about other people. Frankly, the reaction, I think, to the Epstein files in America shows the extent to which Britain remains a healthier democracy with a healthier political system and a healthier judicial system, because we have seen action take place, albeit you could argue far too late and whatever, but there has been a response in Britain, and there has been huge soul-searching within British politics about figures within British politics, whether it's Andrew Mandelson or whoever, connected with the Epstein files, even if it is peripherally. I mean, for God's sake, it's almost brought down Keir Starmer, a man who has no real connection to them whatsoever, other than the fact he appointed a guy who is mentioned in the files. I think what it shows more than anything else, I don't think Trump needs to distract from them, because I don't think they've really touched him beyond the initial cost, perhaps, when he was prevaricating over their release.
Okay, we've got a question from Rory on the YouTube live chat. He says, in 1924, we've got a theme going here, in 1924, Lenin died. Given Putin's advancing years, what would happen if he were to die suddenly / relatively soon?
I mean, this is such an interesting question. I mean, the truth is that obviously Russia has only had, since the end of the Cold War, since the Soviet Union truly collapsed in 1991, it's only had two leaders. Yeah. It's had Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Boris Johnson. Oh, yeah, please have him. And Vladimir Putin. Putin has been in office now since 2000, on and off. President Prime Minister, you could say Medvedev, but I mean, he was still Putin's puppet. So it's had 2/3 leaders, depending on how you count it. And so therefore, everyone in terms of the political system in Russia, it's Vladimir Putin's world, and they're just living in it. And I think what is clear is, obviously we saw what happened with Prigozhin and the sort of aborted kind of coup there. But my understanding is, reading people who know the Kremlin, do Kremlinology and know Russia far better than I do, would say that Putin, in terms of his regime, is that it will be someone who mirrors Putin and someone who, if not chosen by Putin, but someone who by definition is a Putinist because they have survived within that regime for as long as they have. And if we're thinking in the West, if we're sat here thinking, God, if only Putin were to die, and then perhaps we could get a politician with whom we could do business. Putin has created a massive, kleptocratic, plutocratic war machine, right? That is all centred, on this war continuing for as long as possible. You've got all of this. Not only has half of the Russian economy been turned over to arms production, but you've got these, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of young Russian men being paid more money than they could ever get within Russia. Huge parts of the Russian economy now dedicated to and based on remittances, basically, from the war. Putin could drop down dead tomorrow, and all of those structural factors, a sort of war economy, a total war economy, would still exist. And whoever replaced him, it would not be easy for that person, even if they wanted to stop it quickly or to extricate themselves from it. So much has Russian society been geared around this sort of new wartime, as I say, plutocratic state.
I think there are certain similarities actually with Iran, where America and Israel managed to decapitate the leadership of Iran, but failing to appreciate how many layers of people underneath that or of like mind who've been groomed accordingly to carry on the ideals of the revolution. And I think so it is in Putin's Russia, where, as you say, Lewis, if you've made it this far and haven't fallen out of an 8th floor window or accidentally slipped on a bar of soap in the shower and broken your neck, then frankly, there's a fair chance you're going to be fully signed up to Putin and have, your hands dipped in the blood sufficiently that you will want to carry on that legacy. So I'm not sure that any real change comes as a result of him going. Now, Michael Truff on the Sussex coast has been in touch. How bad do you think the May local elections need to go for Labour to make Keir Starmer's position as PM untenable? And if he is to leave, who do each of you think is most likely to be the next Prime Minister?
I think one of the things for Starmer now is that the expectation is so baked in of how bad that they're going to be that it's almost hard to conceive of how bad they would have to be for it to be sufficiently bad for Starmer to go.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that, this Iran stuff as well, I mean, who knows, it could still be going on, who knows what situation will be in by then. Global instability helps Starmer. It helps Starmer enormously, partly because whoever would be Prime Minister is sort of locked into some extent. It would seem an act of both pettiness, self-indulgence, but perhaps profound irresponsibility for the Labour Party to choose a moment of huge global instability to replace the British Prime Minister, because obviously it wouldn't be a quick process either. It's not like the old days when, for example, where MPs used to just decide this stuff. Harold Wilson decides that he's going in 1976 and, within a week or so Jim Callaghan is in. It's not like that. You're going to have, assuming that it's contested, you have a full Labour Party leadership contest. It's got to go out to, you've got to get the MPs nominating, then you've got to get all of the members voting. It's going to take weeks and weeks. And that sort of stasis helps actually structurally lock in an incumbent Labour Prime Minister for whom it is already quite difficult to get rid of them. So I think if there is ongoing instability, the like that we've seen the last couple of weeks or the last week or so, I think in a way that the May elections become less important or seem less important. And Starmer, however unpopular he is, it helps him sort of lock himself in.
So, Michael, I think what's so interesting about your question is that the second part of it is who do each of you think is the likely successor is what makes me think the first part isn't going to happen. That I think that, I think it's still underpriced. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's underpriced, the possibility of Keir Starmer leading Labour into the next election.
I think that's true.
I think it's still very, very possible. And so, okay, I sort of saw your question and I thought, OK, West Streeting. Well, no, West Streeting, does he command enough of the left and he's possibly going to lose his seat at the next election? Or has he gone too far, too fast, too quickly and has upset a lot of people along the way with his apparent ambition? And then you think, well, what about Angela Rayner? Well, yeah, but has she got over her problems with the, HMRC and also, a moderate wing of the Labour Party going to vote for her? So maybe it's not her. And well, what about... And so it goes on. That you think, well, no, they can't. Well, it can't be them. And Shabana Mahmood, no, the left of the party is not going to get behind her. And so every time I keep dismissing somebody who is a potential leader, I then come back to the fact that, you know what, I think Starmer will still be the leader.
And also, I mean, it reminds me quite a lot of the sort of, to mention him again, that the Harold Wilson period in the late 60s. I mean, Harold Wilson, I mean, we think of him now as having won 4 elections out of 5, but there was a period, particularly after devaluation, in which he was profoundly unpopular. I mean, he lost the 1970 election, but there was all this speculation constantly about whether he was going to be challenged, and it was easier to challenge a Labour leader then because it was just the MPs deciding it. So, and yet he survived. And one of the reasons he survived is ever the Labour Party is deeply factional, and each faction is always terrified about the other faction winning, and therefore that they will be vanquished. And someone like Wilson was very, very good at sort of playing those factions off against each other. And right now, if you're not on the soft left or left of the Labour Party, you're worried, because you know that if there's a leadership election now, it's almost certainly Angela Rayner's or Ed Miliband's or someone from the soft left for the taking. There is no way that a Wes Streeting or a Shabana Mahmood, particularly in the wake of the Green victory in Gorton, all of the conversation will no longer be, as it might have been 6 months ago, who's the best person to beat Nigel Farage? The actual question, the essay question, is going to be who can beat Zach Polanski? And that gives you a very different answer to the essay question than if it had been something else. So I think that all contributes to this sense of clinging to Nurse Keir Starmer for fear of something worse.
OK, we're going to come to this final question from Carl Waite. I want to say thank you, Carl, for the question, but it's slightly problematic. I'm going to read it. Love the show. Do you ever fall out with each other, or have a disagreement, or what you should talk about on the podcast? Lewis?
I have nothing to say.
I want to say that we love each other very dearly.
What?
That there is never a crossword.
Oh, shut up.
We agree the whole time with each other and just support each other as fully as we can, as true and dear friends.
This really is no dick energy.
But it would be a bloody lie. No, of course we
Have you noticed there aren't any live shows going on at the moment?
We all talk to our therapists about some of these issues.
We will be back on Monday. Thank you so much for listening to this live edition of the show. We'll have more soon. See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.